In the high country above the Green River, where the wind smells of pitch pine and wet granite, there lived a man named Elias McCord. Folks called him Iron Hand, though he never said why. Some said it was because he could twist a horseshoe straight with his bare fingers. Others swore it was for the way he worked wood clean, exact, and sure, like he was shaping the forest itself to his will. Elias had come west with the Ashley Henry outfit in '23, trapping the green and the snake, riding with men like Bridger and Sublette when the beaver were thick and the mountains were raw with promise. But after the trade went lean and the fur prices dropped, he stayed on. He'd had enough of Street Louis and its noise. The mountains fit him better, cold, quiet, and honest. By the time he was 40, Elias lived alone in a narrow valley below the Gros Ventres. His cabin stood there like it had grown from the earth, logs notched clean and tight, roof sodden with pine needles. The creek ran 20 steps from the door. Every part of it had a reason, and every reason had been learned the hard way. Most cabins on the frontier were hot as a forge in July and froze solid by December. Men tried everything, stuffing moss between logs, hanging buffalo robes on the walls, digging cellars. But Elias's place was different. No matter the season, it breathed like a living thing. The air stayed cool when the sun was cruel and warm when the frost bit deep. Trappers passing through would shake their heads, muttering that Iron Hand had some secret the rest of 'em didn't. They weren't wrong. Elias had learned the trick 15 years before, in a place few white men had seen then, up in the Wind River country, wintering with a band of Crow families. He'd traded meat and hides for powder and tools, lived among them long enough to understand how they read the land. It was an old woman, many lodges, who'd shown him something that stuck. She taught him how a lodge breathes. It was the dead of winter, and the wind came off the peaks like a knife. Yet her lodge stayed warm, not by the fire alone, but by the way it was built. The smoke hole at the top, the low doorway covered with rawhide, the way the hides were stretched and angled, they worked together like a set of lungs. When the air inside grew heavy, it found a path out. When the fire burned, it drew fresh air low and slow, keeping the warmth close to the ground. "Air moves like water," she'd said through the translator. "If you know how to guide it, it will work for you, not against you." Elias never forgot. Years later, when he built his own cabin, he thought back on that lesson. He cut the logs from North Slope timber, denser and cooler peeled in spring when the sap ran. Before laying the first log, he dug a shallow trench under where the hearth would sit, running out beneath the cabin's wall to daylight. He lined it with stone, capped it with split boards, and left a narrow opening at each end. Then, behind the fireplace, he built a vent shaft that rose through the back wall, 2 logs apart, chinked tight, the space between them hollow. At the top, under the eaves, he carved a small opening covered by a wooden flap he could open or close with a lever. When the fire burned, warm air rose and escaped through that shaft. The pressure pulled fresh air from the trench below, passing beneath the hearth and into the room. In summer, when the fire lay cold, the mountain breeze flowing down from the creek would travel that same underground path, cooled by the earth before it reached the cabin's heart. It was no magic. Just the same logic as a crow lodge, turned to log walls and stone hearth. Trappers called it Elias's breath, and some tried to copy it. Few managed. They'd build their vents too wide, or place the trench where rain could flood it. But those who followed his method found they could last winters that would have driven a lesser man back east. One summer, Kit Carson himself stopped by the Green River Valley on his way north. The story goes that he spent a night under Elias's roof and noticed the air still and cool despite the blazing day outside. When he asked about it, Elias only shrugged. "Just built it the way the land told me to," he said. Carson chuckled. "Reckon the land must talk kindly to you, Iron Hand." Elias didn't answer. He was staring out toward the peaks, listening to the evening wind moan through the pines. The trick spread quiet, as things do among men who live by silence. By the 1,842nd, a few traders' cabins along the Yellowstone and Missouri had borrowed parts of his design. Larpenteur wrote in his journals of a venting hearth he'd seen once among the free trappers, ingeniously contrived. He called it, "by some mountain carpenter whose name is lost to me. Scholars later found mention of a breathing house in a Crow account collected by James Willard Schultz half a century later. That was Elias's mark, not in books, not in statues, but in the way the wind moved through a cabin long after his bones were dust. In his last years, Elias kept to himself. He hunted little, trapped less, but tended his cabin like it was a friend. When the spring melt came roaring down, he'd clear the air trench of silt, patch the vent flaps, and check the stonework. Come summer, while other men sweated and swore in their stifling rooms, he'd sit by the hearth with the door wide, feeling that slow, cool breath drift up from the floorboards. One traveler who visited him in '48 wrote later, "I found in those high hills a dwelling that seemed to think for itself warm as a hearth in winter, and cool as the shade of a pine in July. Its builder, an old man with eyes like flint, spoke little, but I fancy he knew more of air and earth than any learned man I ever met." They found Elias McCord's cabin still standing 20 years after his death. Moss covered the roof. The logs were silvered by sun and snow. But when a party of surveyors stepped inside, the air was sweet and dry, the floor cool beneath their boots. One man lit a small fire in the old stone hearth, and before long the smoke drew cleanly up the chimney. The flap above the vent stirred and clicked in the draft, still breathing. It's said that one of those surveyors wrote to the Museum of the Mountain Man years later, describing the strange design and the legend of Iron Hand's cabin. No one could say where he learned it, or if the old Crow woman who'd shown him the way was ever real. But the principle was tested, proven, and rediscovered by modern builders 100 years later as passive ventilation. And maybe that's how all true mountain wisdom works, born of hardship, carried by word of mouth, and finally recognized by men with books and blueprints who call it science. But out in that high valley, long before the engineers, Elias McCord already knew, a cabin, like a man, must breathe to live. By the winter of 1826, the mountains had shown Elias McCord everything they had to give beauty, danger, and the kind of silence that can either steady a man or break him. That year was the coldest he ever knew. Even the old hands, Bridger, Fitzpatrick, and the rest spoke of it with a quiet respect. The Wind River froze solid before Christmas, and men who'd trapped it their whole lives said they'd never seen such iron cold. Elias was wintering with 3 other trappers, a wiry Kentuckian named Luke Harmon, a French-Canadian voyageur called Leclerc, and a half-Shoshone boy, barely 16, who went by Little Fox. They'd built a cabin on the edge of the Gros Ventres River, not far from where it meets the Snake. It wasn't much. 4 walls, a stone hearth, and a roof so low a tall man had to stoop. But it was tight, and thanks to Elias's design, it breathed even in that cruel season. The men lived mostly on dried elk and beaver tail, melted snow for water, and waited for the thaw that never seemed to come. The snowdrifts climbed to the eaves. At night, when the wind moaned over the ridges, the cabin creaked like a ship in a storm. It was during one of those nights that Elias's breathing trick saved their lives. Leclerc had gone out before dusk to check his traps. He didn't come back. By midnight, the others knew something was wrong. The temperature had dropped below 40 below, the sky clear as glass, and any man caught in it without shelter wouldn't last an hour. Harmon wanted to wait till morning, but Elias was already pulling on his snowshoes. "You'll freeze," Harmon warned. His beard rhymed with ice. Elias only grunted. "He's one of ours." He strapped a torch to his pack and stepped into the blinding white. The moon was so bright it threw shadows across the snow. He followed Leclerc's trail down the creek, each step sinking to the knee. It was an hour before he found him half, buried in drift, his foot twisted, a deadfall pinning his leg. Elias chopped through the frozen wood with his axe, wrapped Leclerc in his own blanket, and hauled him back, inch by inch, over the snow crust. By the time they reached the cabin, dawn had just begun to gray the peaks. The cold had bitten deep. Leclerc's face was ghost white, his fingers stiff as antler. They built a fire fast. But when the blaze caught, the heat roared up too quickly, filling the cabin with thick smoke. Harmon cursed and flung open the door, but the wind drove in snow and bitter cold. That's when Elias moved. He kicked shut the door, opened the vent flap above the hearth, and cleared the stone trench beneath the fire. The smoke curled once, then straightened, drawn cleanly up the chimney, out through the vent, as fresh air crept low and gentle from the trench. The cabin began to breathe again. All that day the men tended Leclerc, thawing his frozen hands with snow, rubbing them till color returned. The boy, Little Fox, watched Elias work, his dark eyes wide with awe. "How you make fire not choke the house?" he asked in halting English. Elias smiled faintly. "The fire needs to eat same as us. Give it air the right way, and it'll behave." The boy nodded solemnly, as though learning a sacred thing, and in a way he was. By the third day Leclerc was awake and talking. He'd lose 2 toes, maybe 3, but he'd live. When he finally managed a weak grin, Harmon clapped Elias on the shoulder. "Reckon your crow friends saved us all." Elias didn't answer. He was staring at the vent shaft, watching how the air shimmered above the flame. The memory of that old woman, many lodges, returned to him, the calm in her eyes as the blizzard screamed outside her lodge. She'd known what the mountain would teach him later, that survival was a matter of listening, not conquering. Weeks passed. The fur trade that winter was thin, the streams were locked in ice, and even the beaver had gone deep into their lodges. The men kept their traps pulled, waiting for March. In the evenings they'd sit by the hearth, talking low and slow, voices blending with the crackle of pine knots. They spoke of the rendezvous coming that summer. Word was, it would be held on the Green River near Horse Creek, where every trapper, trader, and Indian from 100 miles would gather. There'd be whiskey, trade goods, stories, and more noise than any of them had heard all year. Harmon swore he'd sell his pelts and buy himself a proper rifle. Leclerc wanted powder and coffee. Elias said little. The mountains had become his only company, and the thought of crowds no longer stirred him, but he agreed to go. "We'll need salt and lead," he said, "and I could use a new axe." The thaw came late that year. When the river finally broke its crust, it went with a roar that shook the valley. The men packed their furs and gear, shouldered their rifles, and headed down toward Play, the rendezvous grounds. The journey took 2 weeks through melting snow and swollen creeks. Along the way, they met other trappers drifting in from the Yellowstone and the Bear. The air grew softer, heavy with the smell of wet sage. When they finally topped a rise and saw the Green River Basin spread out below, hundreds of tents, lodges, and smoke trails rising, they felt like they'd reached another world. There were mountain men from every outfit: Ashley's, the Sublette brothers, even some old Hudson's Bay trappers from the north. The rendezvous was equal parts market, carnival, and battlefield of bragging rights. Whiskey ran like water, and the night echoed with gunfire, laughter, and the guttural songs of a dozen tribes. For men who'd spent a year alone, it was a kind of madness. Elias sold his packs to a Street Louis trader for good coin and a new iron axe. But it wasn't the trade that drew talk that year, it was his cabin. Word had spread among the trappers about Iron Hand's breathing house, and before long men were pressing him with questions. "How's that vent of yours work? You mean to tell me the air moves on its own? Reckon you could show a man how to build one?" Elias gave answers in few words, sketching rough drawings in the dirt, explaining how heat rises and air must replace it. Most only half listened. Whiskey dulled their curiosity. But a few took notes on scrap paper, eyes keen. Among them was a young man named John Johnson, newly come west from Pennsylvania. Years later, they'd call him Liver-Eating Johnson, but that summer he was just another green trapper learning from older hands. He'd remember Elias's lesson. When the rendezvous broke and the men scattered back to their ranges, the legend of the breathing cabin went with them. Some said it was Indian witchcraft, others called it mountain ingenuity. But every man who'd survived that bitter winter by one of those hearths knew the truth. It was the kind of wisdom the land gave only once. And as the trappers faded into the wild, some to die in snowfields, some to live on as names in journals, the cabins they built remained quiet and unchanging. Long after the beaver trade was gone and the frontier turned to farms, a few of those old log homes still stood, cool in summer, warm in winter. Each one, in its own way, was still breathing, and each breath carried a whisper of the man who'd first taught the mountains how to draw air. By the time the 1,840 seconds rolled around, the mountain men were fading from the maps they'd once drawn with boot tracks and blood. The beaver trade had died, steamboats had taken the river routes, and the soft hands of civilization were reaching higher into the hills. Some trappers drifted east, some married into the tribes and stayed. A few, like Elias McCord, simply remained. His beard had turned the color of frost, and the rifle he carried had seen more repairs than metal. But his back was still straight, his hands still steady, and his eyes held that hard, distant glint that belonged only to men who had truly lived alone. He stayed in the same cabin by the Gros Ventres, his breathing house. Every spring he'd patch its roof with sod, mend the vent flaps, and re-chink the moss between logs. He kept it as a man tends a grave. And in a way, maybe that's what it had become, a grave for a life that no longer existed. In those days, parties of explorers and surveyors began to cross the valleys, engineers sent west by the Army Topographical Corps, charting the land for wagon trails and future settlements. They were educated men, some foreign-born, some sons of the East, and when they stumbled upon Elias's cabin, they found themselves face to face with a relic who seemed carved from the very wood he lived in. One of them, a young lieutenant named William Rayner, wrote later in his journal, "We found an old trapper dwelling alone near the Gros Ventres River. His cabin was of a most curious design, built to ventilate itself by hidden passages of air. When I asked how he'd conceived it, the man replied simply, 'Didn't conceive it, just paid attention.' Rayner spent 2 nights there, making sketches by lantern light. He measured the angle of the vent shaft, traced the air trench beneath the hearth, and noted how cool the cabin stayed even as the midday sun beat down on the roof. When he returned east, he brought those drawings with him and filed them in the archives of the Corps of Engineers under the dry heading, 'Natural Ventilation in Log Dwellings, Wyoming Territory, 1,844. It would take 50 years before anyone would think to look at them again. That winter was hard. The elk moved farther north, the snow came early, and Elias's joints ached with the cold. He could no longer swing an axe the way he used to, but he still split enough wood to keep the hearth alive. He lived on dried meat, parched, corn, and whatever small game wandered too close to his traps. Most nights he sat by the fire and listened to the wind move through the vent shaft, the soft, steady whisper that had kept him company for 20 years. Sometimes he'd talk to it, half in jest, half in memory. "You remember that winter with Leclerc, don't you?" he'd murmur. "Near froze us all solid, till you started breathing proper." He'd smile, as if the cabin might answer, and perhaps it did. For every sigh of the wind through those logs sounded like a voice older than language. In the spring of '45, a party of emigrants passed through the valley families on their way west to Oregon. They stopped by the cabin for shelter one night, a husband and wife with 2 small children. The woman, her dress torn from travel, marveled at how warm the cabin stayed after the fire went out. "What's your secret, mister?" she asked. Elias only chuckled. "Ain't no secret. The house just knows how to breathe." He showed the man how to dig the air trench, how to angle it so the wind would flow gentle under the hearth. The settler took notes in a small ledger, promising to build his next cabin that way. That man's name was Thomas Hardin, and 2 years later, when he reached the Oregon Territory, he built a log home on the banks of the Willamette. It used the same venting system Elias had taught him. Hardin wrote to a local paper about it, the Oregon Spectator, describing how a trapper of the old mountains had shown him a way to keep his home temperate by the laws of nature. The editor published it under the title, "A Frontier Invention." Elias never knew. As the 1,840 seconds waned, so did he. He moved slower, slept longer, but the mind behind those gray eyes stayed sharp. When the rendezvous stopped coming, when the fur wagon stopped running the rivers, Elias said it didn't matter. The mountains had been his true trade all along. One fall, a crow hunter came. Through the valley, a tall man wearing a wolf pelt over his shoulders. He introduced himself as 2 Feathers, grandson of Many Lodges, the woman who had once taught Elias how to make a home breathe. The 2 men shared a meal of venison and coffee thick as tar. Elias told him the story of that long winter with her people and how her wisdom had kept him alive. "My grandmother said you were a quiet man," Two Feathers said in his tongue. "She said you watched the smoke and understood it." Elias nodded. "I watched, and I remembered." When the crow left the next morning, he gifted Elias a small pouch of sage and eagle down. "For the air," he said. Elias kept it hung by the vent shaft till the day he died. That spring the snow melted late again, the creeks flooded, washing out the trail to the river. No one saw Elias McCord after that. A group of prospectors passing through in '49 found his cabin standing silent. Inside they found his chair tipped toward the hearth, a half-carved spoon lying beside it, and the faint smell of smoke still clinging to the stones. He'd gone quietly, the way he'd lived alone but not lonely, wrapped in the breath of his own making. They buried him on the hill behind the cabin, where he could still hear the wind come down the valley. On his grave they set a rough-hewn board that read, "Elias McCord, born 1785, died 1849. A house that breathes, a man that listened." Decades later, when settlers spread across Wyoming, surveyors rediscovered the ruins of that same cabin. The roof had fallen in, moss thick on the logs, but the vent shaft still stood sturdy, perfect in its geometry. Architects studying pioneer structures would one day call it an early form of passive air circulation, a concept ahead of its time. They'd marvel that a rough trapper with no schooling had built what engineers would later model in universities. In 1965, the Museum of the Mountain Man in Pinedale displayed a replica of Iron Hand's cabin rebuilt from the original plans recorded by Lieutenant Rayner. Visitors walked inside and felt the cool hush of air slide from the floor to the rafters. A plaque near the hearth read, "This design, discovered in 1844 and preserved by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, is believed to have originated with mountain man Elias McCord, whose log cabin employed principles of natural ventilation later echoed in modern architecture." Most tourists simply nodded and moved on. But a few paused, feeling that faint current of air moving against their ankles, like the slow, steady breath of something alive. Out there in the wild country where the rivers still run clear and the mountains still whisper, the wind carries his name softly through the timber, not as legend, not as myth, but as the memory of one man who listened and taught the mountains how to breathe. By the close of the 19th century, the frontier that had shaped men like Elias McCord was gone. Rail lines crisscrossed the plains, telegraph poles ran beside them, and the wilderness that once swallowed expeditions whole now echoed with the clatter of wagons and the ring of hammers. The mountain men, those solitary, stubborn craftsmen of the wild, had faded into folklore. But every so often, a remnant of their wisdom resurfaced in unexpected places. In 1898, a small article appeared in the Scientific American titled "Ventilation in Frontier Cabins." It described a curious old design found in a log structure near the Gros Ventres River of Wyoming Territory, which stayed cool in summer, warm in winter, and notably free of damp air. The author was a young civil engineer named Charles H. Rayner, the grandson of Lieutenant William Rayner, the same man who had once camped in Elias's cabin 50 years before. Charles had grown up on his grandfather's stories: the frost-bitten trapper, the perfect logs, the strange air that moved of its own accord. When he traveled west as part of the U.S. Geological Survey, he sought out that cabin, or what was left of it. What he found astonished him. The roof was gone, the hearth cracked, yet the vent shaft still stood intact, lined with stone. The air trench beneath the fireplace remained clear, dry, and cool. He took measurements, wrote a paper, and quietly concluded, "What this unknown frontiersman discovered by instinct has taken science half a century to formalize." At the dawn of the 20th century, builders began to talk about natural convection, thermal draft, and passive ventilation. City architects claimed to have invented it, but the principle had been there long before, hidden in the lungs of a log cabin no scholar ever designed. Out on the plains, settlers who had once fought the seasons began to notice that certain homes, those dug partly into the hillside or built with careful venting, survived both heat and cold with surprising ease. folklore credited. Some old trapper's trick. In Oregon, the Hardin family descendants of the emigrant Elias had taught, passed down his method like a family secret. When their homestead was catalogued by the Oregon Historical Society in 1932, the field notes mentioned a ventilated hearth said to have come from a mountain man's teaching. No one knew his name, but the handwriting on the sketch looked remarkably like Thomas Hardin's, worn but steady. By 1936, America was caught in the grip of the Dust Bowl. Architects in the West searched for ways to build homes that could endure heat without endless fuel. A young designer named Arthur Morgan, studying frontier buildings for inspiration, found Charles Rayner's Scientific American article in a library in Denver. He drove to Wyoming, to the same valley below the Gros Ventres, and stood in the ruins of Elias McCord's cabin, long since collapsed, reclaimed by willow and sage. Morgan studied what was left and took the concept east, presenting it to the Tennessee Valley Authority during the New Deal years. There, he used McCord's same vent and trench method to design earth-cooled workers' cottages in Norris, Tennessee, structures that stayed 15 degrees cooler in summer than conventional houses. In his notes, Morgan wrote, "The principle is older than the Republic. The mountain men of the early 1800s already knew how to make a house breathe." The papers published his blueprints. Engineers called it subfloor ventilation. But a few old-timers from Wyoming who read the news shook their heads and smiled. "Old Iron Hand knew that 100 years back," one said. Meanwhile, in the high country, the land forgot names but not lessons. The Museum of the Mountain Man in Pinedale gathered the last fragments of that world, rifles, traps, powder horns, and a few old tools dug from riverbanks. In 1965, they built a replica of Elias's cabin using Lieutenant Rayner's original sketches. Visitors stepped inside, expecting a drafty log hut. Instead, they found a quiet hush, no staleness, no damp, the air cooler than outside, even under the July sun. The museum's curator, Margaret Ashby, noted in her field report, "We have tested temperature variance over several months. The cabin interior remains consistently moderate between 58 degrees and 68 degrees Fahrenheit without mechanical assistance. Elias McCord's design functions exactly as intended. His secret, it seems, was understanding what most of us never stop to feel, how air itself behaves. That exhibit still stands today. School children walk through it each summer, their teachers explaining how the old trappers survived the elements. Few remember the name McCord, but they remember the lesson how a cabin could breathe." In the late 20th century, as the modern world rediscovered ecology and sustainability, a quiet irony unfolded. Architects once again turned toward passive cooling, earth homes, and thermal mass. They built sleek glass models with sensors and airflow diagrams, and in doing so, they traced a circle back to one mountain man's logic. Some of those same designers visited the Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Symposium in Pinedale during the 1992nd. One, a professor from the University of Colorado, stood before the reconstructed cabin and murmured to a guide, "This is early bioclimatic architecture. He predated us all." The guide only smiled. "Ma'am," he said, "that feller just built what kept him alive." Today, the museum still holds a rough-hewn beam from the original McCord cabin. The grain is blackened with soot, the wood dry but sound. Carved faintly into its side are two initials, E.M. Above them, the faint outline of a crow's feather, likely a token from the pouch given by two feathers. Visitors pass it without noticing. But if you stand there long enough, you can feel it, that subtle current of air still moving through the cracks, the breath that once filled a lonely man's home in the high Wyoming wind. In the end, Elias McCord never sought credit, fame, or history. He was a craftsman of survival, not a philosopher. But like the beaver that built its lodge with unseen genius, he used what the world gave him: wind, earth, and instinct. From that, he created something far greater than comfort: balance. He didn't build for recognition, he built to endure. And through that endurance, he left a quiet inheritance, one that outlived the trade, the wars, and the age of steam. The land still holds his lesson, that every shelter, whether a lodge, a cabin, or a modern home of steel and glass, must respect the same simple truth. Air must move, fire must breathe. And men, if they wish to survive the wilderness or the world, must learn to listen. As the sun dips behind the peaks of the Gros Ventres, the rebuilt cabin glows gold in the last light. Inside, the air stirs faintly, rising through the vent like a sigh. It carries the scent of pine pitch, ash, and long memory. Outside, the wind answers with the same soft tone it has held for 200 years. No monument stands for Elias McCord, no statue, no textbook entry. Only the living breath of the cabins he inspired, still cool in summer, still warm in winter. And perhaps that's fitting. For the mountain doesn't honor a man with marble, it honors him with wind. And when that wind moves through the ribs of a cabin built by steady hands and quiet faith, that's the mountain remembering, that's the breath returning home. In the summer of 2024, a man named Caleb Rourke drove north from Lander, Wyoming, with a truck full of hand tools, a coil of copper pipe, and a notebook worn thin from years of sketches. He wasn't a historian. He was a builder, a cabinwright by trade, the kind of man who preferred a rasp and sawdust to a computer screen. Caleb had grown up hearing stories from his grandfather, who'd been a trapper himself in the 1,940 The old man spoke often of the Iron Hand cabin, a structure that could breathe the same one rebuilt at the Museum of the Mountain Man. To Caleb, it had always sounded like folklore, a romantic exaggeration from the fur trade days. Then, one hot August afternoon, while restoring a century-old ranch house near Pinedale, he noticed something strange. The interior of the house stayed cool, almost 10 degrees cooler than outside, though there wasn't a scrap of insulation or electricity. When he tore up the old flooring, he found a narrow stone trench beneath the hearth, perfectly aligned with a vent that opened through the foundation. He measured, studied, and finally smiled. "McCord," he whispered. The discovery pulled him into a quiet obsession. At night, he read everything he could from the Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal to Men to Match My Mountains and Win Blevins' Give Your Heart to the Hawks. Buried in one issue of the journal, he found a plant diagram labeled Elias McCord Ventilation System, 1844, Lieutenant W. Rayner Archive. The caption noted that no working replica had been built in the modern era outside of the museum model. Caleb decided he would build one not for show, not for tourists, but for proof. He found a patch of land high in the Wind River Range, near the same valley where McCord had lived. With permission from the State Forestry Service, he began cutting lodgepole pine the old way, green logs felled in spring, bark stripped clean, notched and hand-fitted with a broad axe. Every choice was deliberate. No power tools, no shortcuts. If he was going to understand what McCord knew, he'd have to feel it the same way in sweat, muscle, and wood. By early October, the cabin stood chest high. He laid the hearthstones by hand, using granite from the nearby creek bed, then began digging the trench that would serve as the cabin's lungs. It ran from the hearth's base out beneath the north wall, 30 feet long and lined with river rock. He capped it with flat slabs, sealing each gap with clay and moss. At the outer mouth of the trench, he built a small stone collar with a hinged wooden flap to catch or close the mountain breeze. Then he framed the vent shaft behind the hearth 2 logs apart, hollowed clean between. The upper end opened beneath the eaves, shielded by a shingle of pine. The lower end fed directly behind the fire pit. When it was done, he stood back and looked at it, a copy of a design that had once saved lives in a wilderness long gone. He wrote in his notebook, "It's like the cabin has lungs. The mountain wind moves through it without being asked." Winter came fast that year. By late November, the snow lay thick, and Caleb found himself living inside the cabin he'd built, testing it the way McCord must have, with no electricity, no modern comforts, only wood heat and instinct. On the first true cold night, when the temperature dropped to 10 below, he lit a small fire. The smoke rose steady, not a wisp out of place. The air near the floor stayed cool, but the room filled with gentle warmth, even, breathable. He watched the vent flap above the hearth tremble as the draft moved through it, like a slow heartbeat. In the morning, when the sun rose bright over the peaks, the cabin was still comfortable, no frost on the inside walls, no suffocating heat from the night fire. Caleb wrote again, no insulation, no stove, just design. The air moves because it wants to. He felt, for the first time, that he was touching something old and invisible. Not a trick, not folklore, but a truth hidden in plain sight. In February, a researcher from the Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal, Dr. Lena Garvey, hiked in with snowshoes to see the experiment for herself. She'd read Caleb's letters and wanted to test the cabin scientifically. Temperature gauges, humidity sensors, air pressure monitors. They stayed. 3 days, logging data every hour. The results startled her. The interior temperature never dropped below 56 degrees Fahrenheit, even during a 20 degrees night, and it never rose above 68 degrees Fahrenheit at midday, despite the fire burning low. The air stayed dry, clean, and constantly circulating. She sat by the hearth, notebook in hand, and said quietly, "It's primitive climate control, natural convection." He built this in 1826 before the word thermodynamics even existed. Caleb just smiled and stirred the fire. Guess some folks listen better than others. When they left the cabin, Dr. Garvey promised to publish their findings. The paper appeared in the journal the following spring, titled The McCord Principle, Environmental Adaptation and Vernacular Engineering in the Fur Trade Era. It sparked small ripples in architectural circles. Professors in Montana and Colorado referencing it in sustainability lectures, green builders citing it in online forums. A few even drove out to see Caleb's cabin for themselves. By the end of that year, he'd received dozens of letters from architects, craftsmen, historians, and ordinary people who simply wanted to build something that worked without noise, wires, or waste. He answered every one of them the same way. Start with what the wind is telling you. The rest is just lumber. In 2025, the Museum of the Mountain Man invited him to speak. He stood in the same hall where McCord's replica cabin stood, hands calloused and voice rough, a century and a half after the man himself had vanished into the snow. Caleb told them what he'd learned, that McCord's secret wasn't magic or mystery, but attention. He watched how smoke curled, how cold settled, how heat rose. He listened to the wind instead of fighting it. That's the whole lesson, and it still works. When the applause died down, a boy in the front row raised his hand. "Mr. Rourke," he asked shyly, "does your cabin really breathe?" Caleb smiled. "It does. And if you ever build one yourself, you'll hear it just a whisper under the floor, like the mountain talking back." That night, as he camped again in his Wind River Valley, the air moved through his own cabin, just as it had through Elias McCord's 200 years before. The wind sighed in the rafters, the fire hummed in its place, the trench beneath the hearth drew the mountain's breath. Outside, the stars burned cold and bright over the white peaks. Caleb closed his notebook and leaned back, feeling that same slow rhythm of the pulse of air, steady and ancient. He realized with quiet certainty that the mountain still remembered. And in that breath, in that endless cycle of wind and warmth, Elias McCord still lived. The man was gone, but the wisdom, the craft, the listening, those things never die. They only change hands. As the fire settled to coals and the cabin filled with the soft murmur of moving air, Caleb whispered into the dark, "You were right, old man. A house must breathe, same as the soul that builds it." Outside, the winter wind answered low and kind, as if it had been waiting 2 centuries to agree. By the time spring came again to the Wind River Range, Caleb Rourke's cabin had become more than an experiment. It was a pilgrimage site. Trappers, historians, and old-timers made the drive out from Pinedale or Dubois, their trucks grinding through snowmelt mud to see the little log house that breathed. Some came with notebooks and cameras, others with nothing but questions. Every man who walked through that hand-hewn doorway left a little quieter, like the wind itself had told them something worth keeping. Caleb didn't think of himself as a teacher, but the world had a way of making lessons out of a man's solitude. He'd learned that from Elias McCord, a man who'd never taught a class, never published a word, but whose ideas still lived 200 winters later. That, May, the Museum of the Mountain Man invited Caleb back for another event, this time the Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Symposium, where scholars and reenactors gathered to share their research. He packed light, one axe, one length of lodgepole pine, and a roll of birch bark. When his turn came, he set the log on stage and began splitting it open in front of the crowd. The crack of the blade echoed through the hall. Then he pointed at the heartwood. "You see this core here? That's where the strength lives. That's McCord's way. He built from the heart out." He told them how McCord's cabin design mimicked the crow lodges of Montana conical homes, built to vent smoke efficiently through top flaps while drawing air from cool ground openings. He explained how the Hudson's Bay Company traders used similar wind trenches beneath their stockhouses to preserve pelts in summer, and he reminded them that the mountains didn't care for waste or luxury. Everything had to serve purpose, or it got left behind. When he was done, the audience didn't clap right away. They just nodded slow, thoughtful nods. One of the museum historians later said, "You didn't give us a lecture, Caleb. You gave us a sermon." He only smiled. "The mountains do the preaching. I just repeat the words." That night, he walked through the museum alone, the lights dim and the air cool with the scent of old timber and tanned hide. He stopped before a case containing a rusted axe head, labeled "Recovered near Green River, 1,830 seconds, maker unknown." The display text read, "Possibly the tool of an early mountain man. Identity unconfirmed." Caleb pressed his palm to the glass and felt a strange pull. Maybe it wasn't McCord's axe, probably it wasn't, but that didn't matter. Every axe that bit pine for a winter roof, every blade that carved a vent or notch for survival, they all belonged to the same brotherhood of endurance. And in that moment, Caleb realized something that no book could teach. What mattered most wasn't who invented the trick, but why. It came from necessity, the purest mother of invention. McCord hadn't set out to make history. He just wanted to live through another mountain winter. When June came, Caleb returned to his own cabin to prepare it for summer. The snow had long melted off the peaks, and the creeks ran high with meltwater. He opened the vent flaps, cleared the chimney, and rebuilt the small stone hearth one more time. Then he sat by the fire pit, unlit now, clean and ready, and stared at the dark mouth of the trench beneath. The air moved through softly, whispering of cooler nights to come. He thought about what would happen when he was gone, when the cabin fell silent again, when no man kept the fire going or swept the ashes. Would the wind still move through the stones? Would the mountain remember the breath of its maker? He smiled, knowing the answer. The wind remembers everything. In late summer, the American Mountain Men Association invited him to a rendezvous at the Green River Basin, a living history event in full frontier style. Men dressed as trappers, blacksmiths, and voyageurs filled the meadow with tents, furs, and laughter. There were shooting matches, trade blankets, and whiskey passed under the stars. That night, by the great fire in the center of camp, Caleb told the tale of McCord's breathing cabin. The men listened in silence as sparks drifted into the dark sky. "He didn't fight the mountain," Caleb said. "He worked with it. The wind cooled him, the fire warmed him, and the two danced together without waste. That's the balance. Every man here is still chasing between the heat of need and the cold of the world.